5 o'clock on Saturday. Regular crowd shuffles in. It's a pretty big crowd for a Saturday. And the manager gives me a smile. 'Cause they know that it's me they've been coming to see. They forget about life for a while. Now, John is a real estate novelist. Never had time for a wife. I'm talking to Davy, who's still in the Navy, and probably will be for life. The waitress are practicing politics, while the businessmen slowly get stoned. They're sharing a drink they call loneliness, but it's better than drinking alone. That's a terrible song. Billy Joel. People say he's bad. The songs are undeniably catchy, which means that in a certain base way he's good. Like, he's a good songwriter, and that the songs are pleasing in some way to listen to. At least a good chunk of them, at least to the point that your brain wants to hear them, you know? But lyrically, he is a very insipid musician. The one thing that's very interesting about his songs is how he is always the protagonist, the voice of the song. His perspective in the song is always yelling at people, making demands of people, criticizing people, and is above them. Like, he's either, if he's a character, like in Piano Man, he's literally too good for the people around him. They sit at the bar and put bread in my jar and say, "Man, what are you doing here? You're literally too good for us." And then like Moving Out, my God, just like a bratty teen talking about how everybody else is working for the man, but not me. Don't go changing to try to please me. Just finger wagging and superiority. And then if there's a song that like the character is being criticized, it's always from outside, like Angry Young Man. That's him saying, "Get a load of this guy." You may be right. I may be crazy, but I just may be the lunatic you're looking for. Or he's doing some very pretentious attempt to do a novelistic, like, character study, like Allentown or Goodnight Saigon. But you know, the songs are fun, and honestly, the chutzpah to write and then release. We Didn't Start the Fire. Once again, mwah. All-encompassing narcissism. It's glorious. But the interesting thing about Joel is that Joel hit his limit of talent and then tried to exceed it, which is pretty rare because musicians tend to flame out early. There are fewer like long-term success stories who get to a point where the pop format is no longer worth it. Like they've exhausted all the possibilities of it from their point of view, and so then they have to try something else. If they're still, challenging themselves, if they haven't checked out like Mick Jagger, who's happy to sing Satisfaction 400 times a year. He tried to do classical music. He tried to release like, I think it was like actual classical music, like for an orchestra. And no one liked it. It's like, oh yeah, that's actually the limit of your ability, Billy. And I honestly think that might be why he keeps trying to kill himself with alcohol, because he has not given up his fantasy of himself as a great artist. That like justifies his torpor. Is that, look, I'm a great artist. Look at all the stuff I've done. But then, he ran out of stuff to do in pop, and he tried to do some stuff in a more challenging, more complex, larger format art form, and he was mediocre. And so what's he going to do? Stop being a celebrity? Stop being a musician? No. Just going to dial it in at Madison Square Garden and keep wrapping your Bentley around trees in Long Island. Another guy who did that, Garth Brooks, by going the Chris Gaines thing. And honestly, Garth Brooks' status as like the most well-adjusted musical genius of American history is proven by the fact that he got to the edge of his talent, his ambition met his ability, and he just said, "Oh, okay," and then he retired. Went to Oklahoma and hung out with Trisha Yearwood. Then he did like a comeback a few years ago, because he missed the big crowds, but like he didn't feel like he had to be an artist anymore. Unlike Billy Joel, who's cannot get over it, so he keeps divorcing younger and younger women and drinking more and more. Because if you're not going to come to terms with who you are after a certain point of hedonic pursuit, it's going to destroy you. You're either going to turn into a piece of jerky, like the Sybaritic Rolling Stones, or you're going to just be a big weepy drunk like Billy Joel, or you're going to keep pushing yourself until, if you're good enough, you find yourself finding satisfaction in the pursuit of a deeper art. Like, the reason Kurt Cobain killed himself is because he knew he didn't have it in him, just like emotionally, to carry on the hard work of being an artist, to what would be necessary to overcome the torpor of being a fucking rock star. And so, cashed his own check. What are they going to do? I mean, the answer is, for these people who are that successful and huge, just do something else. Or don't do anything. But you have to have a certain degree of ability to just be with yourself to handle that. And, people, like, we explode out, like, our consciousness explodes out like Big Bang style. Especially if, as we find ourselves as like in total alienation at the end of history. And what we're doing is we're fleeing from quiet. We're fleeing from emptiness, because emptiness is the one true reality, is the fundamental emptiness of the universe. Which, if you confront that fact and you like really live with it, it makes living much easier. It makes you need a lot less. But if you're escaping, if you're fleeing from that emptiness, if you're always trying to not be in a room alone with your thoughts, if you're always trying to have a earthly pursuit to invest emotionally in, a career, a skill, a hobby, an ability that you can pursue, artistic, athletic, business, you can pursue. And then on top of that, personal pleasures you can pursue. Consumer, the things you can only get from buying a giant house and having a fucking yacht and having a helicopter that goes on top of the yacht. And if you're a musician and you are living by that relationship, at some point you have to mature. You have to let go enough to not need to distract yourself so much. But you're not getting that reinforced anywhere. If you're a success, you just keep pushing and nothing it all gives. There's no resistance. And so you press until you find resistance, either by indulging yourself to the point of physical annihilation or pressing yourself, demanding something of yourself artistically until you hit a barrier. And of course, none of this is to blame anybody. Like if somebody has ADHD and they say, excuse me, I can't sit with my thoughts, it's literally impossible. That's because that's how we have been acculturated. We live in a world where you can't do it. Where we have been so stripped from our bodies. We have been so disembodied by engagement with a pseudo-reality of mediated identity that we cannot be in our bodies. There's a constant panic because we live in a material world where we are finite beings, but our brains are separate and eternal. How are you supposed to live trying to reconcile that every moment of your life? Your brain is the world, the universe, all of time and space. You are God. Because remember, it is a soul consciousness that has no connection to any other consciousness. But our bodies are the same material as everything else. The same flesh as everything else, governed by the same laws of thermodynamics as everything else in the universe. And it is trending to death. It is trending to decay. Physical pleasure is trending towards redundancy. And so we indulge the fantasy of immortality, which requires distracting ourselves from our actual bodies, our actual lives, our enmeshed physicality. That means we have to press the fucking pedal to the metal on making our encounters with our body purely pleasurable. Like when our body is going to be noticed, it's going to be noticed doing something fun, in tasting something, feeling a way, having a urge satisfied, feel a sensory experience. Hedonic pleasure. Otherwise, we don't want to hear from it. And that means like you either take command of the world's resources and try to destroy it to the extent that you can in the world of business, in the struggle for control of the machinery, or if you're born lucky but you don't have the stomach for that, you pursue the arts. I will be enmeshed in the system, I will benefit from it, but I will not directly contribute to the carnage of it. And the thing is, that's reasonable. Why would anybody give up comforts that are all they have? And then they compensate for the fact that they're doing all this indulgence by the fact that, but I am also doing this artistic project. I'm making people happy. I am, there is a social affirmation of it. And there's a combination of that artistic integrity and then the hedonic pull. And there's this push and pull between them. And the people who make it to old age in rock and roll, for example, have been just turned into pleasure lizards. Where their humanity has been just totally vestigial, but that means that they, have to keep pursuing this lifestyle that killed everybody else in their cohort, and that they just survived. So yeah, being a pleasure lizard is the best you can hope for, because if you're here for a finite amount of time, life is only going to get worse over time because you're losing time on Earth and your brain can't handle it and you're being panicked about that emptiness that you cannot absorb and you cannot metabolize. And the pleasures that you seek only become commonplace and become banal so that you're not even getting the pleasure out of it. The only pleasure you're getting is the pursuit of a fantasy pleasure and the sadistic thrill of seeing others denied the pleasures that you have. That's the best case scenario. Turning into Donald Trump. That's the best case scenario. You're miserable, but you're comfortable and miserable. Physically comfortable and miserable. Even if it doesn't give you any joy, pleasure, any comfort at all, even that you're just screaming rat in a cage brain. None of this has been to your benefit. None of it has actually contributed to your happiness. This is why the libertarian idea of the self, of people motivated by self-interest creating a good society or a just society is insane, because that self-interest is not our self-interest. It is our self-destruction. And our society is destroying itself precisely because everyone is pursuing that. The market only responds to people's death drive, which is to say, give me momentary pleasure in the here and now in exchange for oppression, immiseration, carbon emission, misery dealt somewhere else to someone else. And we imagine capitalism as transactions, right? Freely arrived at transactions. They're not freely arrived at. And the thing that makes them not freely arrived at, the coercion, is the violence done to the biome and to people that is not calculated into the cost of the transaction. And that is a negative feedback loop that undermines our ability to sustain ourselves. Meanwhile, pursuing pleasure, denying, like your body, denying your connection to anything outside of yourself, pursuing just hedonic pleasure, makes you miserable the more you get it. Rich people are not happy. This is the important thing. If anyone is watching The White Lotus on HBO, it's very good. This is what it's about, basically. Rich people are not happy. They are comfortable. They have these things that we connect to some degree with basic, quality of life Maslow stuff like food, shelter, security. They have those things, but their subjective experience of it is of discomfort, anxiety, misery, which they could have had if they were poor, and we wouldn't have to have a world that is choking on their fucking consumption, the excess of their pursuit of something that they can't have. And the algorithm of capital is psychologically wrapped around that impulse. And that means create a machinery of surplus value creation that can be monopolized by people who need greater and greater indulgence to soothe their alienation from their bodies and from the world around them. So, to get to Black Jacobins, this perfectly describes the situation in Haiti. And it describes slave social orders in the New World everywhere. The more these people were able to just sit around and enjoy luxuries, with people literally being whipped within earshot, the more luxuries they needed. The difference between capitalism, the difference between slavery and the more efficient labor regime that capitalism developed and refined out of contact with slavery, is that profits under northern capitalism, as it was devised in the cities of England and then in New England, reinvests profit. A certain percentage is kept for the capitalists, but beyond a certain amount, profit is reinvested in the company. That is where the growth comes from. That's the engine of the whole thing. Under the slave regime, and this is why slavery is a less efficient system, and why once it comes into conflict, political conflict with labor capitalism, it's going to lose as the South lost. It's because that profit gets privately consumed. You don't need to reinvest beyond a certain amount. There's only so much land you can realistically hold. There are only so many slaves you realistically need to hold it. And if it's cotton, you have very little capital investment. Rice, the same thing. Sugar is different, and sugar helped create sort of the closest thing that the slave economy had to a proletariat, because it was relatively capital intensive. You had like little miniature manufactories on plantations in order to take the sugar cane and turn it into the paste that could be stably shipped. But you had to do that on site. It couldn't just be shipped to another processing place the way that cotton could. But even then, there's a limit to how much you have to invest once you've made that capital. You just have to maintain it, because there's only so much sugar. There's only so many things you need. What you do with the rest of it is you consume it. You sit in you either go to Paris so you can have more fun in the temperate regions, or if you don't have enough money to do that yet, you spend it all sitting sweating in your fucking living room, trying to find more and better wines to drink, more silks to wear, all the while terrified of being fucking brought to justice by the people that you're exploiting to make this happen. And as our global ruling class begins to have the same relationship to us emotionally that those French planters did to their slaves, you're going to see, and you are seeing, this insane explosion of consumption. Billionaires now aren't at the top unless they can go to space. They have to bid up experiences among the rich, because thanks to our global village that we live in, they are as aware intellectually of the exploitation that goes into their consumption as a Haitian slave owner was to his fortune. You had fucking Bezos say in his stupid cowboy hat, thank you to all the Amazon customers and employees who paid for this. Those stakes are only made possible by the amount of money involved, by the amount of misery caused by that money, and the amount of misery that these rich freaks feel themselves and can only extinguish through consumption. And that's why we're at the end of this thing where now, because this is not anyone's individual choice, because these decisions are made below the level of choice by the profit extraction mechanism that carries out through the technological structure. And, when I say technological, I just don't mean computers and the internet and fucking container ships and factories. I mean governments, languages, the entire human apparatus of extension of human will wrapped around one human will, the abstract human desire. Abstract human hedonic desire. All of technology wrapped around that spoke. And it's pulling the skin off of the earth. And so these rich people at the top who are basically along for the ride and have to spend all this money and create all these fantasies of eternal power to make up for the fact that they all know at a certain level that they're not actually in charge. They have been disabused. The 20th century was one big psychic break, as every class everywhere came in contact with capitalism in its final form and reckoned with what it would mean for their identities. And they fought back one way or another. And then they were accommodated into the system one way or another. And now we have a ruling class that used to have a basis of power in land that was only constrained by other humans and God, which just meant their conscience. That was power. That was power through human history. But in the European struggle for dominance, these earthly powers unearthed the demon. They dug too greedily and too deep and brought forward this machine that they wielded in battle with the other European powers to preserve their position, but then over time saw their position overturned, saw their power evacuated. democratized into a bourgeois state structure that would carry out the will of no individual person, but also not the people, as early liberals thought they were going to do, who didn't understand what technology would do to it. Marx understood what technology was going to do to this relationship. It was going to not be on behalf of the people, human beings. It was going to be on behalf of the id of the middle class. And that has been what has driven politically the structures of liberal order ever since. And there was strike against that. There was a fight against that. Everybody fought against that. The old ruling elite fought against it. From the fucking English Civil War to the French Revolution, they fought against it. In 1848, they fought against it. The workers, or the former peasants, being pulled into industrial relationships, pulled into a proletariat, either pulled from an artisan class or from the artisan class or from the peasant class, turned into a new urban proletariat who could only sell their own labor. They fought back too, from the peasants' wars to their sides within all these conflicts, because they often supported the emergent bourgeois because they were the most coordinated and organized and motivated. They were the progressive historical force. And they took power. They seized controlled the state mechanisms on behalf of a notion of democracy that was theoretically, and in their minds at that point, encompassing of some group that was beyond themselves. Some group that was composed socially. But it was never the case. It was always the individual id of the unorganized, lumpen middle class operating as independent beings without a coordination. The way that the working class was able to create coordinated mechanisms of asserting power through labor unions and political parties, and through the Soviet Union, and all the post-colonial nationalist and communist movements. All of them failed. Wars emerged, millions died in the fight between these three forces. And what emerged was this new social order governed by no human consciousness, no human will. And you can call it technology or you can call it capitalism. It's the same thing in the end. Because if it's just a machine, it is a machine that is programmed by people. And those people operate through structures of political and economic and legal power that are created by this machine, or by this social formation. There's rich people, but they're essentially along for the ride. They're there to move money around. They're not there to actually enact a will. The closest thing we have to a will is the outcome of the democratic process in the form of the collective desires of the middle class, which in America, thanks to our free real estate and the fact that we could create a subject caste that was outside of the realm of full political subjectivity, that middle class included a lot of the workers, included a lot of people who were workers and had a relationship to the means of production that under Marxist orthodoxy should have pulled them towards class consciousness. But the creation of the Fordist Compromise shattered the conveyor belt that led working experience to working class consciousness. Because instead of living in tenements in the packed streets of Europe the way that Marx imagined working class people, and that American working class had been like in the early 20th century, they were pulled out of those relationships and put into the gentry life of a low landowner. They were given the yeoman dream minus subsistence, which is the important part. They have lost the subsistence that yeomen had that gave them freedom and independence from having to sell their labor. Now they have to sell their labor, but in exchange, they get land. And they get an investment instrument that gives them the same material interests in the continued health of the capitalist economy that the ruling class do. And so when the crisis of the 70s happens, by this point, the working class can no longer express itself as the working class in the political realm. All you have instead are a bunch of working class people voting subjectively as their along allegiances to a fake pseudo class of homeowners that had the trappings of class because, hey, I am a little bit of a capitalist. I have a capital asset if I have a home. So, like, I'm not the same. I'm still a worker, but now I also am a little bit of a capitalist. So that means that that's part of my understanding of myself and my interests that I put alongside my working class identity. But as long as there's a political structure that allows me to express my class interests, my working class interests, I will vote for that. But by the 60s, the two parties had headed off the threat of populist revolt from below, broken the back of the working class political power through Taft-Hartley and suburbanization, the carrot and stick of the Red Scare and Taft-Hartley, plus high wages and Levitt towns. So because the Democratic Party essentially strangles its own connection to the strangles the working class within its coalition, replaces it with this new consumer identity where the working class people are now, they are still part of the coalition of Democratic voters, but where they were a coherent working class project within the Democratic Party, they are now just more voters, along with the urban professionals who vote for Democrats, and the southern rural types who vote for Democrats at that point. They're all just part of a coalition of individual voters who perceive themselves as capitalists because that's what's on the agenda now. Taxes and social policy. They've given up hope of control of actual production, which is the end goal of union organizing and the working class movement. The teleology, and all movements need a teleology, of the teleology of the socialist movement, the working class movement, the labor movement is control of production. Not extracting higher wages, not getting a house in the suburbs, control of production. But Taft-Hartley, the Red Scare, had broken the back of the labor movement, made it so that it couldn't grow at the same speed, and wouldn't have the same active, ideologically committed leadership that was destroyed by the Red Scare. So, since the Democratic Party is a bourgeois party, controlled by the bourgeois, always was, even during the New Deal, it the bourgeois interests reassert themselves completely. They no longer have to contend with the working class within the Democratic Party. And so politics becomes a question of responding to social ferment that is created by structures that have been deemed beyond politics. And so when the crisis of the 70s comes, the answers that the working class should have been demanding, like, okay, this is the point when capitalism has reached its full, it has exhausted its social role, its progressive historical role. But where is the working class? It's gone. It's been turned into people in the middle class, people in the who are responding to politics through a cultural screen and caring about things along the lines of their cultural conception. Because now they are middle class, which means they are consumers. Because you're either the dividing of the old socialist division of the world between makers and takers is correct. There's those at the top who eat on from the sweat of the brow of those on the bottom. That's always been and always is the case. The difference is that the subjective experience of being in that relationship differs depending on what your job is. There are a lot of people who technically are exploited in that their surplus value is taken by their employer, but who don't really feel that way because the job they do is pleasant. The job they do gives them meaning. The job they do provides a sense. It is not alienated from them. The time they spend doing it isn't fully alienated, the way the time that a 19th century laborer's time at the line was fully alienated. No brain, no choices to make, no will to assert, just carrying out a mechanistic act, mind-numbing. Time on life, time on earth that you'll never get back, alienated, stripped from you. Being at the center of the fucking post-war empire, this thing made of technology that requires all these superstructures within it to function, this architecture, this cultural civic architecture, gives a lot of jobs that can provide meaning because they don't involve a lot of physical exertion unless it's met with independent ability to decide what to do with their time on the job. So you need some combination of that, and that is affordable under the Fordist Compromise because all the real exploitation is being done at the end of the supply chain under the auspices of local bourgeois powers that are essentially clients of the United States. And even those factory jobs that the guys, the relatively alienating factory jobs that these new home-owning working class people had, the alienation of it was undermined by the fact that they did have access to a home. They did have access to conveniences. Of course, it topped out, and there was a lot of alienation very quickly building up because, hey, everybody else gets to hang around in cities drinking coffee and writing reports and they get to have the same lifestyle as I do, but I gotta still fucking press this button. And the Levittown or the Lordstown strike, which was part of the big labor crack-up of the 70s, was a strike that expressed that reality. Young guys who were brought to this new state-of-the-art facility and given good pay and benefits and houses struck because the work sucked. And if you create a society around people sitting around having leisure, people whose work is alienating are their enjoyment of that life is made less by seeing other people have better, and so they get resentful. Everybody gets resentful. That's the middle class existence, is precarity, being stuck between, isolated with no class, no solidarity, stuck as a pure subject of capitalism. And that is why the middle class in control of politics leads to annihilation. Because it is misery. It's this social misery that doesn't have the ease of wealth or the solidarity of poverty that wields the machinery towards annihilative ends. Because it's just a machine of resentment, of everybody feeling resentment all the time. And the thing is that on the other side of that divide, the people who do get to sit around on their ass, they are feeling misery because they're seeing all the people who don't get to do what they're doing, and they're feeling guilty about it, and they feel responsible for it. And then they have to build up castles in their minds to understand why it's okay that they're in this. And that involves them being better than other people. It involves them being better than the retrograde, better than the spoiled factory workers who are still racist. So it's either guilt or resentment. In the middle class, when I say middle class, I mean not an actual class. Homeowners. Precarious homeowners. Let's put it that way. Precarious homeowners. Not in the sense that they are either at risk of losing their home or they know they have kids who aren't going to be able to have homes. And that their home, if they sell it, is not going to provide for their kids, or they see their family line declining. the thing that's wrong with the PMC discourse is because it's supposed to describe just these people. And I think that the professionality of it is beside the point. What matters is what is motivating their politics. And the answer is it is a expression of their alienation from within a system where they perceive themselves as receiving the benefits of capitalism, but are still miserable. And that means the PMC is the same thing as MAGA. It is people in the middle section who do not have the comforts of solidarity or full security, and therefore power their politics through a lens of resentment and self-exculpation. Like, everyone talks about how, people have pointed out, like, the Republicans have more fun because they get to transcend norms and they get to trigger the libs. But the problem with that is that it means that they have to, like, get genuinely upset when Colin Kaepernick kneels. That's not fun. Like, these guys talk about how, like, they hate football now. It's like, of course, none of them, they all said we're going to boycott it. They still watch football, but they like it less. They have less fun watching it. But they have to sustain their identity as Republicans, as good people in their understanding of it, means pissing off liberals. And that means being pissed off at what liberals do. It's resentment politics across the board. It doesn't matter if you're in the cities working as a graphic designer, or you're a fucking adjunct professor, or you're a teacher, or you're a nurse. None of these, like, oh, are you a working class? Or none of these fine grade cheese, whether you're some sort of urban whitish worker, or you are a landlord in Lubbock, if you're a fucking beautiful boater somewhere in the hinterland, your politics are not motivated by attachment to material interest. They are motivated at base and at the level below consciousness of a desire to punish your enemy. Politics cannot change material conditions. You believe that. If you're a fucking homeowner, you have benefited enough from the system over your life that you are committed to it ideologically, as in below consciousness. So you're not looking to rock the boat. You're not looking to change capitalism. You're looking to make the system more amenable to you. And that means, sure, in your conscious mind, if you're a PMC liberal, we want to raise up the poor, benighted minorities. But in practice, they're not going to rise up because of the racist whites. So what you can do, what you can root for above anything, is the racist whites to suffer. Same thing goes for the boat owners, petty bourgeois, whatever, streamers, anybody who was at the Capitol, whatever. They are motivated by a desire, yes, to defend America, and to be able to consume all they want and drink all the beer they want and eat all the burgers they want and not wear masks and trigger the libs. But once again, their ability to make that decision is going to be squeezed by forces that aren't political. What they can do is they can root for the suffering of the libs. It's a pure resentment politics that is driving the system towards collapse, because you are talking about a situation where there is a fundamental dissolution of the social basis of the fiction of the United States of America. The only question is, will there be enough material intervention in people's treats to break their balance? Because right now they're happy to just post. They're happy to vote for politicians and observe this thing through the lens of the pure removed spectacle. But if actual privation enters the period, if they they go from actually being afraid of losing like basic stuff not freedoms abstractly, but actual pleasures, and then actually losing them, they're going to need to enact their politics more and more. But again, that requires a larger economic crisis that I'm not smart enough to be able to predict. But that's how it would happen if America cracked up. It wouldn't be a civil war, I don't think. It wouldn't be divided along those kind of lines, because it really is an urban, suburban, rural conflict. It is fixed. It is the centers of localized power in the interior of the United States versus the concentrations of finance capital in the cities and the cultures that those two capital formations generate. And this creates competing realities. People seem to be I'm kind of baffled by how much ink has been spilled talking about the fucking vaccine and why people won't take it and what to do about that and how to get them to take it. First of all, a lot of people aren't taking the vaccine because they don't trust, they have no trust in the system, and it's a non-ideological, non-branded distrust of the system. And that is absolutely understandable, because if you have not gotten a good deal out of this thing, like you didn't get a fucking house in the suburbs out of this thing, then maybe you don't want to hear what they have to say. And people who just don't believe it's free or believe that it's not safe. But then you've got people who are, as part of their identity, as part of their brand, have decided that they cannot be themselves if they get the vaccine. Their rejection of the system is very selective. The basic premise of capitalism, the basic premise of the United States and its structures, the Constitution, they absolutely absorb. And that's what they contribute to their happiness, that's such that they have it, and their comfort and security. But it is the use of those structures by others that renders them corrupt. What that means is that as things get worse, as their precarity increases, as their sense of control over their life drains, as their even ability to get all their treats under COVID gets compromised, their distrust and hatred and alienation from the system intensifies. And by now, to them, what that system means is the cultural expression of the system. Because what else could it be? That's all we have. What do we see through the looking glass? And what the alienated conservative sees, what the alienated landed homeowner and people in the cultural jetty created by those structures, what they believe, what they see rather through culture, is this culturally alienating display of values that have nothing really to do with economics, no matter how much they talk about communism. It goes down to identity, because this is all about individuals trying to see themselves affirmed through the cultural lens. They see an other. They see someone of a different race. They see someone of a weird gender. And they see that affirmed as above them in the zero-sum game, winner-take-all hellscape of America. And they say, no, thank you. And what that means is that whatever they get from that apparatus, things like, things like analysis of a vaccine, awareness of, the media, the government, specifically agencies like the CDC, bureaucracies, when they come together and say something is happening and assign values to things, they reflexively reverse them. They reflexively reverse it. So when science and the media and facts come together to say there's a virus that's very dangerous, they hear either there isn't a virus at all, or if they can't believe that anymore, the virus is not dangerous. because it's being said by their enemies, so it cannot be true. The virus, therefore, cannot be dangerous. And then when they say, hey, here's a vaccine for that virus, by the way, it's safe. That means the vaccine is dangerous. It's nothing more complex than that. What is said by all the things, the reason it's baffling to people is because they see these institutions, the CDC, the media, government, facts, science, they see these things as the expression of an independent structure that is not political, that has an objective ability to differentiate itself from interests and then tell people the truth, which is the liberal fantasy. And this is the end fantasy of liberals. The liberals are committed to the illusion that there is such a thing as a non-political structure. The conservatives have lost that illusion. They don't believe that if they ever did. Liberals believe that these institutions are transcendent of politics in a way. So they are baffled. Why do you think that a dangerous virus is safe, and why do you think that a safe vaccine is dangerous? And the answer is because they think that those institutions are on your side and that you are in charge of them. And he's largely right about that. When it comes to the aesthetic showdown over culture, the people who make up these institutions are disproportionately liberals. So there's no strategy you can coordinate from within these institutions that will reach them because they are reversing the meaning as they receive it. And you wonder, why are the liberals still believing in institutions? Why are they? Because, of course, the critique of that argument is not reactionary. It's a heart of the socialist critique of capitalism. That there is no such thing as a non-ideological, non-partisan institution within a government. Government is the standing committee of the bourgeois. It carries out the bourgeois' will through its organs. So that means all of its structures are organized around that bourgeois will. And so socialists have disabused themselves of these fantasies, at least a lot of them. Some of them still hold on. Conservatives, reactionaries, have fully given up the idea that there's a non-political institution. Why are liberals holding on? Well, amongst politicians, within the political class, they're holding on because the fiction of independence of institutions is central to the Democrats' argument for themselves as a party. They say, we can work through these institutions to achieve these ends because our will can be our will can be expressed. Your will can be expressed through us and then through these institutions. But of course, it can't be. Their will is disconnected from the machine. The machine operates by the will of capital. Because now there is no working class to pressure from below. There's just a bunch of working class people who think of themselves as either homeowners or Republicans or Democrats who think of themselves as consumers. But they don't know that. They think their class interests, a lot of them think their class interests are still being represented, but they're not. They can't know that, though. So they have to be validated in the idea, they have to continue to validate the idea that there is a independent structure. Because if there's not, then the Democratic Party shouldn't exist. The Democratic Party is a rent seeker in the political structure. Because it literally says, I will help you fill out these forms. If people knew that it doesn't matter what the forms say, then there's no reason to have the fucking Democrats there to fill out the goddamn forms. But for the liberal voter in large, the generalized liberal voter, someone who thinks of themselves as with the people, someone who thinks of themselves as vaguely progressive in some sense, why do they believe in the independence of these institutions? It's because they can afford to. Because they, amongst the people who actually make up the party and make up its media representation and make up its party apparatus that actually coordinates how it's going to run, elections are beside the point. The parties decide who is going to fill them, specifically the Democrats. They have to believe that these institutions work. Because it's their participating in them that makes it work, that makes them worthy of being rich, makes them worthy of benefiting from exploitation. Now, there are plenty of working class people, specifically working class people of color, who vote for Democrats genuinely out of a desire to see their interests fulfilled, their material interests fulfilled. But that's because the Republican Party, by definition, cannot allow them to see their benefit, because black people have the closest thing to class consciousness we have in this country, because of their relationship to the fact that they never got the deal, they never got the post-war deal, they never got bought into the system. By and large, of course, I'm talking about like the center of gravity. That's the real generator of racial disparity into the 21st century, is that they were not brought into full rights after the war. But they keep voting Democrat because they think there's some reason, there's some institutional validity within these structures. And that by voting for them, I am protecting myself in some way. But the people who are better off, who actually staff the party, provide the majority of the money for the party, write about it, and our media members, are well off, are comfortable, and therefore are able to devote a lot of their time and energy to soothing their neurotic guilt of their wealth. Because, remember, the distinction between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives is geographical. It is, how close are you to capitalism? The Republican worldview has been generated by landed power in this country, either in the form of plantation agriculture or the financialized, fully capitalized capital portfolios of the people who followed in their footsteps. The beautiful boaters, the franchisers, the extraction industry members. Was based on intimate association with the rituals of capitalist exploitation. Northern finance capital was conceived and executed by people sitting far removed from capitalism, carrying out ritualized exchanges in abstract symbols that kept the reality of capitalism at bay. And that's the very thing that allowed them to treat industrial workers so terribly. I've talked about George Fitzhugh before. George Fitzhugh was a Southern theorist of slave power, a slavery apologist from before the Civil War, who was the only really intellectually coherent and thoughtful person to ever argue in favor of slavery. Because he did not distinguish in his prescriptions between races. He said slavery is not only good in the South, It is not only good in relations between Africans and Europeans. It is good in all relations between man. Because the abstraction of capitalism allows capitalists to let the market do the violence to their workers and then not feel guilty about it. And therefore not have to build politics around absolving their guilt around it. It wasn't just that owners had a stake, a literal investment in the health of their slaves. It was that they had a proximity to them. And that would, in his mind, create obligation. Bonds of obligation. And what capitalism does is it dissolves bonds of obligation. You are no longer obligated because it isn't you doing anything. Nobody is doing anything. Supply and demand are doing the work. So urban laborers can live in monstrous conditions of filth. All through the 19th century, you saw a stunning trajectory as America's wealth exploded after the Civil War. Average Americans, life expectancy, average size, general health, number of teeth in their fucking head went down. How could that happen in a nation of free people? Because it wasn't the act of a tyrant. It wasn't the act of an overlord. It was lines on a goddamn chart. And we're living at the end of that now, where our politics is completely dominated by this, because these are the actors. The politicians are the actors. The companies are the actors. Everyone else just gets to react, which means we don't get to create meaningful counterculture. We can't do détournement. We can't do shit. We can spit into a fucking fan is all we can do. The battle between the parties is sterile. And that is why anybody who says you need to commit to one party or the other is delusional or a fucking fraud. Because there is a genuine belief that because the Democrats are squatting on this tradition of being the party of the people that they no longer hold, therefore we can try to make the Republican Party the party of the people. Because one of them has to be the party of the people. Like, no, there hasn't been a party of the people for, you could argue, 50 fucking years. And there barely was one when we did have it. So the idea that one has to be party of the people, that was a historical anomaly created by the Great Depression. We now live in the aftermath of that, where the working class has to reconstitute itself through struggle. Somebody says, if the Dems lose, that's bad. Yeah, it is, but what does that have to do with any of us? We cannot coordinate our votes enough to matter. We are all fucking remainders in these goddamn equations. When I say we, I mean everybody listening to this. Everybody reading our shit. Everybody listening to the fucking podcast. We are remainders to the political equation. So me caring about who gets in doesn't matter. Obviously, there are butterfly effects that affect every decision. But at the level of who's president, I think 2020 should have proven that this whole thing is beside the point. It is a busy box for the anxious, downwardly mobile children of this home-owning class who aren't going to get the home and are freaking out about it. Yeah, I do keep saying the same thing over and over again. I've come to terms with that. What I appreciate is that I feel like I am refining my conception of it so that I can communicate it more easily. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everybody. My God. Now, the whole point is that we're dealing with populations, demographic tranches. And within a demographic tranche, it's a big Venn diagram. Some people fill some part of it, some people fill other part of it, but they overlap to create a demographic tranche. And that demographic tranche is culturally, to them, the Republican Party, the project of like national revanchism that they represent, the middle class revolt, the petty bourgeois revolt that they represent, is culturally anathema. And it's not going to not be. Some people are going to trickle over, but it can't. Because like these are deeper, like I said, these are deeper than your knowledge. These are deeper than your conscious thought of who you are and what you care about. They structure your desire. So by and large, they are anathema to the Republicans. So it's not like they can go over there like everybody moving to New Hampshire and becoming a libertarian. The principle is the same either way. It can't work. Because the thing that defines these demographic tranches is that they are just an ex post facto description of a group of people. There is no coordination between them. They participate in culture together, but they do not meaningfully coordinate action. They just express the same preferences through voting because of their general demographic trend. Tranche. Yeah, you won't get that tranche. Oh, you won't get one of them tranches. You get in one of them tranches, oh yeah, you're going to have a good time, I guarantee. So they can't do anything but do what they do, which is respond to things, vote, don't vote. But the decisions are being made by voters, groups of voters, demographic groups of voters, whose commitments are completely different. Whose understanding of all the words that we use to describe politics are different, have different connotative meanings. It means that they see politics differently, they respond to events differently, and it means that they are stuck in this what do you call it? The holodeck. Middle class politics is a holodeck. Bunch of people worrying about losing their homes, worrying about their kid not leaving the house, worried about their mortgage, but fully committed to capitalism, fully aware that the system as it exists benefits them, and see change to it as a threat to their security. And they're the ones having this argument between the Democrats and Republicans that's playing out in policy and is playing out in culture. We can only respond to it until we build something orthogonal to it. And that is the hope. That is the hope that lies at the end. Everyone has to take the black pill. It's like getting chicken pox. You have to accept that there is no hope. Because it shouldn't be about your long-term interest in a future that you're going to be investing in. You have to sever that connection. You have to make your moral decisions in the present. So you take the black pill, you still got to get up in the morning, and everybody who's decided to be a doomer is fucking miserable. They're miserable. That is the ultimate rejoinder, is that these people are not having fun. So you reinvest, you recreate meaning out of, in my mind, the contingency of history and also the duty to leave a mark that others can follow, to leave a trail, to leave a trace in any way. And I don't just mean by posting or doing what I do. I mean organizing, making decisions in your day-to-day life, putting out more good than you take from it. And so you metabolize, oh, okay, this isn't real politics. Oh, that died 40 years ago. Oh, we are just rearranging deck chairs, truly on a Titanic, where the captain has lashed the wheel to the lash of the wheel to the side, has nailed the door shut and shot himself. But we're still here. And if counter-hegemony is the only thing that can challenge capitalism, it can be built. The rudiments of it can be picked up later by other people, even if you aren't able to build it. It's liberating, exactly. There's two things you can be if you really want to stay on the treadmill. You could be a pleasure lizard or a pain pig. And the pleasure lizards are the beautiful boaters, are the villages people, are the resentful petty bourgeois white suburbanites. And the pain pigs are the urban professional class homeowners. And if you stay on the holodeck, you're gonna destroy yourself trying to conform to their politics. So yeah, I talked about how it was the "don't be an asshole, don't be a pussy" party. Those aren't very catchy slogans, and also, as people have pointed out, it's vaguely derivative of South Park, of Team America. Although I would contend it's different because that idea, the Team America thing, by creating asshole as like this third category, sort of allows Americans to like transcend the cynicism. It's the most ideological part of it. The asshole part of the triad there that's the same thing as the sheepdog in the American Sniper cosmology. It's made up. It's not a thing. It's a fantasy. It's the reactionary fantasy that goes with the institutional fantasy that the liberals have. But anyway, for those reasons, get rid of "don't be an asshole." "Don't be an asshole" party are the pain pigs. And the "don't be a pussy" party are the pleasure lizards. But they're all miserable. None of them are happy for a minute. Even though they get to do whatever they want for the most part. Buy whatever they want for the most part. Have whatever fun they want to have for the most part. But it is that most part that drives them insane. They're denied everything they ever wanted. And even if that's unrealistic and impossible, they're going to keep pursuing it forever. And then, as their misery increases, their desire to see their enemies punished will eclipse all other considerations in politics. Pure id versus superego. With the poor ego, the poor people themselves being destroyed, being strangled, being broken away until all we have are these monsters who have lost their humanity. The human part will have been broken off. When the walls go up and we get the little compounds based around these identities that we are going to call governments, and they're going to have their little techno-feudal armature of coercion, everybody inside that circle is going to be a monster. Because the real human thing that kept them connected to a full human consciousness was the people who are on the other side of that fucking wall, who have been dissolved. And the real fear I think that a lot of people have, not everybody, but a lot of people who really invest in online politics have, and the thing that fed it, and the reason that they are terrified of global warming and its consequences in the future, is not because there's going to be a climate collapse that kills them or makes them have to live in a Mad Max world. I think they say that. I think that is actually their pleasurable fantasy. The thing they're really afraid of is ending up inside the circle and having to live as a monster in order to preserve their comfort. And I would say that I am one of those people. I am way more afraid of that than I am of the system breaking down and me having to fend for myself, free of the shackles of precarious indulgence. So once again, I did not really talk about Black Jacobins, which is fine because I didn't really finish reading it and I said I would. So either Friday or next week, we will talk about the rest of Black Jacobins. But we'll see. Catholicism, I think, has its virtues because it emerged from a social context that involved human relationships, where there was actual power in human hands and therefore responsibility in human hands. Technology has wiped that all out. So that's why and one of those technologies that wiped it out was Protestantism, which was a spiritual solvent that dissolved the bonds that had kept up the feudal order and allowed the market logic of capitalism to arise. But what that means is we can't go back to Catholicism. That is undialectical. It's got to be something else. Something that is as universal as our imagined understanding of humanity is. The benefit of technological intimacy is that we do know that we're one species now. We really do know that we're one species now. And so that means that our religious conceptions should emerge from that awareness instead of out of the parochial fixedness of our previous pre-capitalist religious formations. We need a new one. We need a new religion. We need blockchain. We need a new religion. We need a lot of stuff. So the challenge of the moment is letting go in a time of terror. Because comfort, I talk about how comfort breeds neuroses, but a certain degree of comfort is necessary to prevent the emergence of deep neuroses around the fear of genuine harm and danger. I don't think Buddhism works either. Buddhism is just as geographically and temporally fixed as any of these other religions. None of them are going to feel natural to people outside of certain frameworks. They're going to feel alien. That's true of all of them. It's going to have to be a religious vocabulary that encompasses everybody. And that's not true of any of the existent religions because they were all forged in fixed pre-capitalist social relationships that persisted through time and space. And that means that they were instrumentalized by the ruling power of the time and have been instrumentalized by capitalism. There's a reason that the ideal spiritual life is one where you don't really encounter anybody. It's either a hermit in a cave or part of a monastic order where you have self-sufficiency and stability and no responsibilities, or minimal exchanges with strangers, with non-intimates, with people who might bring heat, might clash with you. And that's not realistic for us. And I think every religion understands most people are going to have to live with a portable version of religion. They cannot be sustained in the frictionless ether. It has to be rugged. I think somebody says Zen priesthood different. Zen seems like a whole different deal. Because like Zen seems to be part of that tradition that says you don't actually have to withdraw. You don't have to deny yourself these emotions. You just have to process them as they occur and extinguish like their clouding of your consciousness instantaneously. It's a very high, it requires a lot of mental dexterity to do, and it requires a lot of practice. It's in many senses easier to withhold, if you can, to withhold yourself. Yeah, the new religion must dethrone consumerism. It must reassert an emotional value around the social at its base, which we do not have. No matter what our religion we carry around with us every day, our calculus, our sense of, our motivator is wired towards a very narrow aperture of hedonic pursuits. Because our vocabulary has been impoverished, because it's all been run through the machinery of capitalism and been drained of sacredness. It's been drained of meaning. All these forms are dead in our mouths. All these words. Like religion, the reason people fear theocracy is because the idea that it would be authoritarian, because they imagine themselves being compelled by the state to do things. The vision of a theocracy is that you wouldn't need that because everybody would do things because they believed in them and they had a similar understanding of what the good was that they would act towards. That would be a perfect theocracy. It also describes the condition of the state having withered away. We need new terms and new religions because when you say Christianity to people who aren't Christian, it is understood as one more identity that is an expression of a consumer preference, just like all the others. And so rule by people thinking that they're that is going to be rule of the consumer preference of those people. So of course it will be authoritarian. And people who aren't of that and don't like those words are going to resist it. So it becomes an obstacle. It has to emerge organically. Because to have a free society, in a free technological society, people have to have an internal governor of how much is too much. People have to say, no more. And that means throughout the entire structure, political leaders, business leaders, whatever you have. This is the virtue that Robespierre was trying to impose. This is the virtue that the McDonald brothers had that Ray Kroc didn't. The thing about capitalism, though, is that Ray Kroc will always beat the McDonald brothers. Over time, he will always win. So that means that he will take over the system. Which means you cannot have structures that can allow that to happen. But that means people acceding to a limitation on their consumer ability. Hey, you don't get to buy everything you want. You don't get to hypothetically have any experience you want. In order for us to redistribute things more equitably. If you perceive that only as a diminution of your freedom and identity, you will resist it and you will have to be fought and destroyed. Unless you accept it. Unless you understand, oh yes, there is a greater value than me. There is therefore enough. But people are only going to get there if systems don't exist that allow them to have that power. And that is why the early stages of revolution, by any definition, would be authoritarian. Because you have to keep people who want to consume from grabbing the reins of fucking government. And they're not going to listen to you. Because they believe deeply that their freedom, that goodness, depends on them getting whatever they want. And they have to be physically disabused of that notion. But over time, as distribution is equalized, as people see that there's a benefit, there's an actual benefit to participating socially, to imbuing social relations with meaning, that there is something that you get in exchange for that lack of consumer choice. Oh my God, I'm not just giving up consumer choice. I'm getting all these other things. Holy shit. Then you create a system of true consensual rule. And what's going to get people to live that every day is going to be some spiritual understanding. Vocabulary, symbols, rituals, that they wrap those beliefs, those behaviors around, and that make them, that inform their choices as they move through the day, that currently don't exist. But the thing about that revolutionary element of that moment of authoritarianism is that you would not have this being carried out by some fragment. You would be having this carried out by the organs of the actual working class. So there would be a social underpinning guiding the actions of everybody within this structure. And because of that, they would give up the power. Of course, this is where people say, this is ludicrous, this is happy talk, this is fantasy. Never has happened. And that's true, because every revolution is tipped over to the point of, has tipped away from the point of real, permanent revolution. And so the regime went into self-defense mode and was no longer able to cooperate. But there's nothing else to believe in, so you might as well come to terms with it. All right. Next time, I promise we'll talk about Black Jacobins.